Hey, thanks for taking the time to participate in our web survey. We are studying the difference between different methods of studying Chinese characters. This is a research project that we are working on as part of fulfillment of the requirements for a master's degree in teaching Chinese to speakers of other languages at Ludong University in Yantai, China. So let's go ahead and talk about the problem. Basically, the problem for American students, to summarize it really down, is that we don't like rote memory. We don't like just saying things over and over and over again or reading them again and again. We want to find ways that are better, and really with good reason. So if you've been learning Chinese characters for very long, I hope that you've come across some things like this. Memrise. This is a great website that gives you a bunch of really good mnemonics, spaced repetition, as well as a fun learning environment to go ahead and increase your character retention. One of the keys of Memrise is their creative mnemonics. So we have things like this, where you see a picture of a cow that's holding a test paper. That's supposed to help you remember that cow is the pronunciation of the word for test. But the difficulty is that it's hard to remember this shape, the shape of this character, which also is the meaning for cow. And so you have to turn to other mnemonics. One of the most popular ways to do that is actually similar to this resource called Chinesey, where you can see the pictures of the characters look a lot like what the characters mean. That's really helpful in a lot of different ways. But in the course of doing this, I was looking for a way to make a better method. And that means something that doesn't require two separate mnemonics for every character. Instead, trying to put them all together, something that would be very helpful with pronunciation, with remembering the character shape. And so I came to this. It's called Tuttle's Learning Chinese Characters, a revolutionary new way to learn and remember the 800 most basic Chinese characters. And it's really a pretty simple process and a really innovative strategy for learning Chinese characters. So let's go ahead and talk about it. It has two steps. The first step is to learn the radicals. Now, the radicals are the character parts, and probably if you've learned any number of Chinese characters, you've already come across this. This is pretty straightforward, and I think pretty simple. Most people are familiar with this. So for example, if you're trying to learn mu, the character for tree, it looks kind of like a tree, and so you might have a picture that reminds you of that. Or if you're just talking about a radical that isn't a character by itself. So for example, the character that, or the radical part that looks kind of like a lid, that's the word that we'll use to describe it. This is a very common method. I think you may already be familiar with that. So let's go ahead and move to the second part. And this is really where the fun part of this method is that there are, for every character, there is a story that goes with it. And that story has both a meaning, pronunciation, and shape component. So let's go ahead and talk about how that works. For an example, we're going to assume that you already know these three radicals. For the character for several, which looks kind of like several wickets that a ball is going through, and the character not, which you could say it looks kind of like a dove that did not make it through the ceiling, that he got smashed on the top. Or you could say a tree looks kind of like a tree, which I think that one's the most obvious of these. So those are the key words that we're going to use for those as we use our mnemonic. So let's go ahead and take them apart. Most Chinese characters are composites. They're not just a radical by itself. It's usually a combination of radicals together. And so these radicals, when we put these two parts together, in this case just two, we're going to make the word machine. And so you can see those two parts, they put both the character for tree and the character for several together into one box. And so now you have the character that means machine. Again, for many students, they're pretty familiar with that part of the method. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a picture, or at least a sentence that helps you to visualize it. And once you get used to the illustrations, you'll be able to visualize it even without a picture. That's the goal. And so here's our picture. You'll notice here we have a machine that looks like it's built in the forest. Now you can't tell exactly what the machine is. It's making sausages or something. But behind, you can see that there were several trees that were used to make the machine. And so now that you see this, if I ask you what parts go together to make the word machine, maybe you'll already remember, oh, several trees. And that would be right. So that's the first part of every picture. Let's do another example. So using, again, the radical for tree, now we'll use the radical not. And so you want to put these two together. So we're going to look at the word cup. So when you take the first part tree and the second part not and put them together, it makes the word cup. And so for that we have a picture that actually has a little story with it. There's a couple lumberjacks here, and these lumberjacks are trying to chop down the tree, but the head guy says that not the tree with the cup. And so you think about that, oh, okay, all right, so whenever you have a cup, that you remember it's not the tree. And so those two radicals will come together, and we're going to make it into a picture that will help this stick in your memory better. Now, research shows that when you visualize things, it's going to help you remember it better. So being able to do this on your own is going to be helpful. So now let's go to the second part. Each part, I said, has a meaning and shape component, which is what we were just looking at. And then it also has a pronunciation component. This is one of the most difficult parts for foreigners learning Chinese, that how do you associate a shape with a sound when it's not at all phonetic? Well, to do that, what we're going to have is key words for every word that uses an English word to help you remember what the Chinese sound is. Here on the screen I've got some examples for you. So for example, the word pizza is the one that we're going to use for the Chinese sound P. Now I've got the IPA there as well, so you can see that the beginning part of the sound is actually the same. Similar to the word board, that's the beginning part of that word is similar to the Chinese word bo. And so it sounds pretty similar. And honestly, if you are able to get those sounds correctly, that's going to get you a long way. That if you come to China and you say P instead of P, it's going to sound a little different, but you'll be able to be understood. But right now, we're not really worried about correct pronunciation as much as the fact that you can remember it in your mind, that you can link these characters together with the shape and with the meaning. And so we've got words like mango for mang. And so if you say it with a British accent and you say mango, it'll sound almost exactly like it, or with a bonk and bang. And other words like fungus we'll use for feng. So I hope those sounds are going to be helpful. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Now what I think is the most difficult part of learning characters, and in fact when I first started learning characters it was so hard I just left it off, and that's the tone. And it's really a shame that we would leave it off, because I assumed it would just come later and I wouldn't have to learn it at the beginning because I didn't know how to learn it. There really was no method for me to stick these tones with every character I was learning. But this method that we're studying is actually going to use what's called an archetype. Archetypes are going to be things such as a giant, a fairy, a teddy, a dwarf, or a robot. And every picture that you visualize or that you see in the text is going to have a picture of one of these 5 things. And each of those things symbolizes one of the tones. Now you may already know Chinese has 5 tones. The first tone, ba, is the high tone. And then the second tone, ba, is the rising tone. The third tone, ba, is falling, then rising. The fourth tone, ba, is the falling tone, and then the 5th tone, ba, is a neutral tone. Now I think those might be easy to remember with these archetypes, because if you think of someone's that's high, well, the giant is very tall, he's high. The fairy can fly, and so she's rising in the stories. And then you have Teddy, that when you feel down you can hug your teddy and that will help you rise again, so it's falling and rising. And then the dwarf is short, and so that's the tone that just falls short. And then the last one, the robot, has no expression, so the neutral tone is represented by the robot. Maybe that sounds really complicated, but in actuality, once you get used to it, it's going to become second nature. I think having these in your mind can be something that will really aid you along the road. The goal of the book that was written is really to help you overcome the too many, too few problem. And that means that so often you cram so many characters in your head that you can keep them there for a short time, but you just don't have enough connections to keep them together. Well, this method is to help you really click them into your mind, help you attach them on hooks in your mind. So let's go ahead and put these pronunciations into play now. First of all, we're going to go back to our machine. Do you remember what the machine means? Well, you remember that you've got the tree and several together, and then the meaning of that is machine. And so that is pretty straightforward. I think you've got that. So let's add the second part of the picture now. The second part of the picture shows the picture of the front bumper of a Jeep with a license plate that says Giant on it. And what we have here are two keywords to help you remember the pronunciation. The first one is Jeep, which sounds a lot like the Chinese word ji. And then the second part is the pronunciation. You remember the archetypes? Which one is the giant? The giant is first tone. And so since you have a giant G, you know it's the word G with first tone. So G is the pronunciation for the word machine. So let's go ahead and put this into our story now, that every one of the words that you study can have a story with it. And so here's what it says. It says it took several trees to provide enough wood to make the parts for the huge machine. When it was finished, they had to get the giant to bring his Jeep to deliver it. Now, in all of these sentences, you don't need to labor to memorize the story word for word. What you need to make sure is that when you visualize the picture, you can pick out the keywords that are necessary for each of the parts. In this case, do you know what the keywords are? Well, you know that the parts is you need several and tree to make up the two parts of the word machine. If you remember the word machine, that gives you the meaning. And then you've got the word Jeep to give you the sound, and then the word giant to give you the tone. So once you learn that sentence, when you visualize that picture, then you can get these 5 keywords from that. And that's really your goal. If you can remember these 5 keywords after you've learned your radicals, then it's pretty quick that you're able to remember all of the different parts of the character Ji. And so let's go ahead and go to our second example again. Do you remember what this picture is? Well, this picture is to remind us that tree and not go together to make the word cup. And so we're going to add the second part. We're going to add the pronunciation now. You see here, we have the giant included by holding his hand in there. And so the giant is holding a piece of bacon. And again, the bacon is our sound word. So that the first part of bacon, bei, sounds just like the Chinese word bei. And again, the giant represents first tone. So the word is bei. And so with this is the sentence that will come with it. That I said not the tree with the cup tied to it, cried the horrified lumberjack to his apprentice. The giant collects the sap from the one to cook his bacon in. And so here, the story helps connect the different parts. That when you remember that they're arguing about which tree to cut down and that he shouldn't cut it down because of the giant and his bacon, then you're able to put all the parts together. That you can pull out your, again in this case, 5 keywords. That not, tree, cup, bacon, and giant go together to make both the character and the meaning and the sound of the word bei. Does that sound a little complicated? Well, I'm going to add one more thing for this part that makes it a little bit more complicated. It's really not bad at all. I think this will be easy for you to remember. When we talk about complications, this is probably about as easy as it gets. Remember that I said most Chinese characters are composites, that they're made of several different radicals. Well, sometimes the radicals can stand on their own. They can be a character of themselves. And that's the case with the radical for several. When it stands on its own, it's the character ji. And so that means you also need to learn a pronunciation for this radical. When you need the pronunciation, you can't just use the shape. You're also going to need a mnemonic. You're going to need to visualize a picture to help you remember a sentence. You'll need the keywords to remember the pronunciation for several as well. So whenever we have a radical that stands on its own, we're going to introduce a wheel into the picture. And that's what we have in this picture on screen, is that now we have the Jeep driving with Teddy driving it. And out of the back are flying several wheels. And so the keywords that you're trying to pick up here are several, from which you get the shape, if you already remember your radical, and then the word wheel, and that means that it's a radical is also the meaning. So if you remember the word several, then you have both the shape and the meaning. And then the last part, obviously, is the pronunciation, that the word Jeep is similar, except this time it's a Teddy driving the Jeep. Now that's important because you're coming across here one of the first words that you need to differentiate between 2 different tones. You can say ji, but no one is going to ever think that your meaning is several, because the words are really different in Chinese. You really need to learn the pronunciation. And so because of that, we're going to just include the pronunciation here. We need to include both the we need to include both the sound as well as the tone. So let's go look at one more example. So here's our last example. So here's the word for mouth. That's a pretty straightforward shape. You can imagine someone with a square mouth, and I think that radical is pretty easy to learn. So let's go ahead and get the pronunciation for it as well. So here you can see that there's a wheel in the mouth of the cave. I think that part you might be able to guess pretty easily. So the mouth and wheel go together. So that's the meaning and the shape. Now can you guess what that pronunciation is even without seeing the words? Well, you can see there's a teddy there, and he's putting on a coat. And so that's our sound word, is that coat sounds like the Chinese word ko. And then the third tone makes sure that we know, or Teddy makes sure we know that it's third tone. So let's go ahead and review that really quick. First of all, you need to learn the radicals. When you see the parts, when you know the shapes that go together to make the composites, then you're going to be able to learn your characters well. So then in step 2, once you know your radicals, then for every character you're going to learn a set of keywords. And those keywords are going to help you. Remember, for the composites, you're going to learn each of the keywords for the different parts that go together. And for the radicals, you'll have just a keyword for the radical itself, as well as the wheel. And that should help you remember that it doesn't need any additional parts. And then the last part for the archetype, let's just review that the giant is first tone, the fairy is second tone, Teddy is third tone, the dwarf is fourth tone, and the robot is fifth tone. So I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I would love to help you more with this. And if you would like any additional follow-up in addition to what we already have here, I would love to help you learn characters better. Again, because this is the way that I have found very much the best for me. And I hope it's helpful for you in your quest to learn Chinese characters. Thanks so much for helping us out.